Hi, can the virtual people hear me okay?
Yes.
Hey, that thumbs up. Okay, welcome everyone. We'll probably get a trickle in of a few more people, but I just wanted to kind of explain what the session is going to be like. Thanks so much for coming, especially in the last block of the conference. So we're going to be talking about studying generalizability in psychology, current approaches and future directions. We've got both virtual attendees and presenters and in-person attendees and presenters. So please just be patient with all the technology we're going to hopefully be able to have a very good hybrid discussion. The format of the session is going to be, we're going to hear some short talks from, like I said, both virtual and in-person presenters. So that will take the first hour of the hour-and-a-half session. And there will be the opportunity for a quick question or a couple of questions after each of the individual talks. Then we're going to open up to a bit more of a general discussion with everyone. That's what you can expect from today. So I think we can get started. So our first speaker is Sakshi. So Sakshi, can you please share your slides?
Sure. Can you see my slides? You can. Yeah, is it full screen?
So actually, we can see the notes as well. So I think, I'm not sure what type of sharing, but yeah.
Gosh. See, this is why relying on notes is always.
Pardon? Sorry, it's quite noisy.
One trick is the switch. There is like a switch, like a button on the right top corner. Switched screen, I think.
Switch screen. Geez. Okay, I think I'm just going to drive straight in because I don't know if this is going to.
Okay, we can't see anything right now. Down. Sorry.
All right, now.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much, Priya and Kathleen, for this lovely invitation. Really excited to be talking today about the role of systematic reviews and meta-analyses as tools for generalizability. As I was sort of reflecting on this talk and putting it together, I feel like this was my first window into meta-science. Very early on my PhD, I started sort of coding the weird acronym, which sort of led to me discovering this area of sample diversity. So I know it's the end of the session and I want to keep it brief, but I thought I would start by sort of giving you three my takeaways in my coding or in my sort of experience of how I have navigated these tools to understand the extent of diversity that sits within the field. So the first is how systematic reviews actually give us a nice baseline of the current evidence, but also demonstrate how it's skewed. The second is how it's going to be more around scoping reviews and particularly unpacking how sample diversity is almost a neglected source of heterogeneity. And the third, I'll go into more meta-analyses and a more focused discussion on how reaching adequate statistical power is actually quite tricky with these. So starting with the first, what I'm going to be doing in the next few slides is showing you a little bit of data. However, in the interest of time, I won't necessarily go into the data, but really more broadly discuss the implications. So starting with systematic reviews as a tool to essentially pick up on how much diversity sits within the research population. This is a world map that shows you the extent to which certain countries are overrepresented in my small sample of under 300 articles focused on smartphone research, where US is more dominant in the global north and China is more dominant in the global south. We can also sort of use regional stacked area plots to see the distribution that exists within continents and across continents. And interestingly, there's a small percentage of articles that are always classified as unknown, which typically don't have any origin. We can also look at tree maps to visualize which countries, again, dominate the research discourse and which countries are more overrepresented. And finally, another helpful tool or another helpful way is to gauge citation bias, because citations are not only important academic currency for researchers, but also help discover diverse research. And in our case, we didn't find much difference, but it shows you the skew across global areas. But really to broadly sort of look at the implications now and think about who are we missing and who are we serving with our science in a particular research area, the question naturally is that the majority of research population, as you can probably see in this cartogram, sits in the global north, yet the majority of research sits within the global south, yet majority of research population sits within the global north. So there is a little bit of a discrepancy here. But what is the impact of this in the way we measure things? And what is the impact of sort of this skewed sample diversity on the way we think about the generalizable effects? And here, I just want you to take you through for a minute, just to visualize with me on what ideally the research population around the world should look like. So ideally, we would want it to be a normal distribution representing all species of humans. However, it more or less is more skewed and might be also skewing the research landscape of whatever behavioral measure of interest, which is on the x-axis that we might be interested in. Systematic reviews do help us sort of discover a little bit of this variance in measures. Switching gears to sort of the importance of sample diversity as a neglected source of heterogeneity, we know that the lack of missing research populations is not only a problem in global north versus global south, Western versus non-Western, but it's also very much the case within Western populations. So how we sample, and particularly systematic reviews, give us a nice benchmark of where most of the population comes from. And naturally, we rely mostly on convenience, student samples, very little on disadvantaged and representative. Again, this is a small sample size of 300 articles, but I can see how this can naturally be a good proxy for other areas of psychology as well. And then also looking at demographic diversity, whether that's, education. So gender and age is often measured, but education, ethnicity, income, all those very important indicators of demographic diversity, which are very important for us to control for when looking at variations across our population, is also missing. And finally, bringing it back together, one can almost imagine that as research is growing across the global south with greater big team science studies, we might see a further skew if the research that we're picking up from around the world may be overly educated, younger, and perhaps rich populations. And finally, in the last minute or so, I just want to quickly touch upon meta-analyses and the challenges we faced, at least while sort of making sense of conducting this. So this, I'm going to show you a very quick visual of a forest plot. This looks at the effects of the effect sizes of about 28 articles. I think we calculated about 48 effect sizes. On this chart, you see that the red lines, the red dots, the red squares actually represent global south. So that's 7 articles out of 28. And again, this is a small sample, but it helps us understand how we can almost think about visualizing variations across global north and global south. And the black dots are more global north. And we found, together with my colleague, and I think one of my colleagues might be in the audience or is at least at SIPS, Louisa, we conducted a meta-correlation and found that, at least in the global north, we found a positive and significant correlation between the effect of sort of social media use on adolescent mental health, but a null and non-significant correlation in the global south. And naturally, we attribute this to the lack of power, where global south populations were barely 6 or 7 articles, and that really sort of meaningfully restricts our ability to make sense of where the entire research landscape. So just to end, I think systematic reviews and meta-analyses are a great first order approximation of helping us establish generalizability of effects, but to an extent, and it's a little bit like this cartoon here where you may be looking for a wallet when you know your wallet is lost, but you're really looking for it where the light shines. And in thinking about where our research sits currently, and our current evidence base is so skewed towards Western pockets, that looking for generalizability here is also slightly tricky. And just to end with, if we really truly want systematic reviews and meta-analysis to help us investigate generalizability, we need to look at more research that includes not only in systematic reviews, looking into multilingual databases, and going beyond the mainstream of databases that we typically use, but also conducting more diverse research so that we don't run into more power and statistical issues and are able to make meaningful representation, and more importantly, accurate and fair representations of the human population. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and would love any feedback, but I'm guessing I've eaten up all my time, so I'm happy to move on.
Thank you so much, Sakshi. What a great way to kick off the session. You haven't eaten up all your time, actually, so we've still got 2 minutes for questions. I'm going to open up to virtual participants first. Is there anyone who has a question who's on Zoom?
I have a question.
Yes.
Just very curious, like very interesting talk. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Like, can I ask for the citations part?
Yeah.
Is that related to language? Because like I know that there could be some distinctions between like different regions, south and north. But yeah, do you think that that's also like related to the language of the publications itself, and how they actually distribute to different regions?
That's very, very true. And actually, in our small sample, I think 96% were English, and maybe a meager 4 was like diverse languages, which not only included global South languages, but also included a lot of European languages like Portuguese and Spanish. It's interesting because we didn't look at language as a source of the citation bias, but actually, I think your hunch may be right that might also play an important role in understanding the variability in citations that exist across the global regions. So yeah, that's definitely something that might be important.
Thanks very much. And do we have one quick question from the in-person audience? No? Are there any more virtual questions?
I'm just so happy I didn't take up my time. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't have a question, but I think this is really important work, and I hope it will be published and will get a lot of attention. Our science needs this. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to do the virtual to in-person transition now, because our next speaker is Daniel. So I'm just going to get his slides set up now. No, you were muted.
I was muted. Okay, I'll start over.
Okay,
Sorry,
wait,
person.
let me make sure. I want to make sure the muting's sorted and the sharing screen is sorted. So
this is exactly what happened to us.
it's good that you're okay. Okay. should be good.
Okay. I really just introduced myself, so I'm going to just go on from here. But my name is Dan Harushka. I'm not a psychologist. I'm an anthropologist and criminologist, but I'm interested in psychological and behavioral phenomena. I'm going to talk a little bit about our attempts to study social discounting in rural Bangladesh, a place I've been working for the last 14 years. Before starting, I'd just like to acknowledge. Yeah. Okay, I'd just like to acknowledge collaborators, most importantly, Shati Munira, who I work with in Bangladesh, and also Rita Jesmine, who are both leads on the team in Bangladesh. And then especially Leo Tiokin, who was a grad student in our program at the time that this study was conducted. He actually collected data in Indonesia and moved on from PhD in anthropology. You might have heard of him to some interesting work in metascience. So who has heard of social discounting before? Okay, so a few folks. Howard Racklin and Brian Jones introduced this to psychology. It had this concept was available in economics before this, but in 2006, they introduced it partly as an analogy with intertemporal discounting. Has anyone heard of intertemporal discounting before? More of you. Okay, so intertemporal discounting is you're more generous to your future self if they're closer temporally to you than if they're farther temporally. Social discounting is you're more generous to people you feel closer to than those who you feel farther from. Not in terms of physical distance, but in terms of emotional or relational distance. And so this pattern that they found, they called it a hyperbolic relationship between social distance and your willingness to forego some cost to benefit someone else, has been replicated now dozens of times. It's been cited by some as a law, and also been introduced as, there have been evolutionary theories introduced to explain why this is a universal human pattern. But is this premature? Most of the studies have been done on college students, educated or online student people, even though they might not be from the United States or from weird countries, they're usually in these modalities. So online or educated populations. Even research citing support for it that claims cross-cultural reliability focuses almost exclusively on university students or online samples. Oh, how do you go back? There. So I got interested in this because I had been doing work on human friendship. I was trying to understand it cross-culturally. And the challenge of studying friendship cross-culturally is that the word like friend in English might introduce a much larger group of people than, let's say, drug in Russian, which might be a tighter set of people. So that term can actually, category can mean different things in different settings. So I wanted some kind of ordinal measure or index that we could use to understand friendship and other friend-like relationships in different cultural settings. And so I embarked on a project in rural Bangladesh looking at a few hypotheses. One is that, for example, and this comes out of the work of Joan Miller, that in Hindu populations, people might be less concerned about relations in terms of how they interact with others and more about social duty. So not personal relationships, but more general social duty. And so we expected that Muslim populations would have more social discounting and Hindus would have, for example, attenuated social discounting. There was also an economic hypothesis we looked at. But the fact is, when we actually got the data, and I'll tell you, we did a lot of work to pilot this. We took actually 2 seasons to pilot to understand the concepts in the local area that we could use to understand social discounting. And what did we find? Well, not only was social discounting attenuated in the Hindu population in Bangladesh we were studying, it was attenuated in the entire population. In fact, it disappeared completely. We could not find it. We tried many different ways of studying it, but using the traditional techniques of Racklin and Jones, we could not find it. So those are the flat lines. I asked Leo Tiokin, who had a field site in Indonesia. It's like, that's also semi-literate and a rural population. Would you try it out? He tried it out. He got a flat line too. It was higher, right? So people were more generous. They forewent more to give someone else a benefit, but it was completely flat too. This on the right, in your right side, shows that actually it wasn't that our measure, our dependent variable, was bad, because we were detecting other relationships with things that matter. For example, how much you felt the partner needed that money that you might be giving them, or the benefit you might be giving them. And this just shows another example of how when we ask people after the fact, and when you're doing this in diverse settings, you should always ask people what they think the experiment means or what they're doing. We found that in the Bangladesh sample, everyone said need was important, but almost no one said relationships were important, right? So this is a little bit of additional support that we're not just finding, it's just not a null finding because our methods are bad. There's something going on there. So we found no evidence of social discounting in rural Bangladesh or Indonesia. All those fancy hypotheses that brought to the field were irrelevant because no one was discounting anyway. So you couldn't even examine variation in it, right? There's no moderation whatsoever. And we did a bunch of stuff to try to figure out what's going on. It's not likely a floor effect because when Leo went to Indonesia, it wasn't at the bottom of the chart. He was in the middle, right? It wasn't likely due to a problem with DV because DV is related to a lot of other predictors, like, for example, the perceived need of the partner. It's not likely due to a problem with the interdependent variable because we spent a ton of time trying to study this, asking people what it meant. And when they talked about it, it was very similar to the way that US undergrads or the general population in the US talked about it. And it's not likely due to protocol modifications because we did do a lot of protocol modifications, but then we actually took it back to the United States and did it with US students, and we replicated what you normally find with US students. So we did a lot of work to try to figure out what's going on here. So I'm going to leave it at that, which is, I'm so excited to be among a group of psychologists and get your thoughts, right? What would psychologists do at this point? Finally, COVID is over, so we can go back to the field and start thinking about where to go from here to understand this null finding. And then another issue is that, so I'm so excited that you're running this unconference today, because I feel that generalizability is a huge issue in the behavioral sciences. And it's something that we can't understand truly, as the first presenter mentioned, until we actually work with more diverse samples. The challenge, especially for early career folks, all academics, is that it's incredibly costly. It took us 4 field seasons to do this, right? Which means you have to travel, you have to cultivate really meaningful and long-term relationships with the field. These are all costly things. And so what are ways that we might incentivize or encourage people to embark on these costly but important endeavors? So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely great. Let me just stop sharing. So first I will, if I can work out how. There we go. One sec. Bear with me, everyone. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions from the virtual participants. Let's start with Natalia. Sorry, I'm not sure what order the hands were put up in, but yeah, let's start with Natalia.
Hi, sorry, I don't know either because I haven't seen if I raised my hand first or not. Sorry if I'm coming.
No, go for it.
Good. I have a question. I missed a bit. I mean, at the beginning, I may have missed the information. So I have a question to Daniel. I'm familiar with a couple of these studies. And I'm a bit intrigued. I'm teaching a lot about experimental methods to my students in Brazil. And I guess it's like, why do, I think your work is awesome, but I'm wondering, when you look at social discounting, you're looking at North American undergraduates as your US sample, right? They were undergraduates. Why not choose to compare perhaps with people from other communities inside the US, where you can actually have a look at differences regarding social support, extended families, or other types of community that we know that they probably exist within, I'm sorry if it's not the US because I may have mistaken, but the weird sample that you use. And I'm asking that because I know that Bangladesh is far as a rural zone area, but we quite often feel like we need to go too far to do some comparisons, and sometimes it might be better to just get a population that shares similar characteristics, people from the United States, for example, but they do differ in quite a few significant traits that could affect, for example, social discount. So that's why.
Absolutely.
So the question is,
you raise a really important point. We have done this with the general population of the United States. We've done it with online samples as well. So we've done it with all this, and we've always found social discounting there. And also the social discounting literature, some of the work in the United States has already shown it, right? So it's not like we're doing any service by just going to other populations in the United States so far. So I think in our case, we did it and we found it like you find it anywhere else in the United States. I would be hard pressed to predict a population in the United States where we would not find social discounting. We still don't understand why we're not finding it exactly in the Bangladesh setting or the Indonesian setting. But you raised an important point. Doug Medine says this too, is that in many cases, we can just go 10 miles from university and find really important variation rather than having to go cross-culturally. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And do we have any very quick questions from the audience here? Yeah, go for it.
Very briefly, we should talk after. What it means to be 20 social distancing apart.
Yeah, so that's how we had to modify it. So we literally, we had photos of people and we had them from their community, right? And most of the people we interact with on a daily basis are in this community, right? And so we'd ask them to choose the 20 people they feel closest to. Now the word benishte really means thickest with, kind of like dikke vrienden in Dutch. But it means the same thing when we talk to you about it. And then we'd actually have them literally put them in order in terms of how close you feel. And then we take the first and the second and the fifth and the 10th and the 20th. That was one modification we had to do. And then we did that in the United States as well. Yeah, we can talk more about that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so next we have Adeyemi. So I'm just going to set up the slides. So patience, everyone, please. 1 second, let me just show. Yeah, 1 second. Let me just set it up so that it can see you as well. Is that close enough?
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Adeyemi Adesula. I will be presenting today improving generalizability by engaging Africans in victim science. So maybe you might have noticed when she was presenting, like we only have one spot for Africa. So that's a problem, and I think we need to resolve. That's the presentation guide. Generalizability problem. I think maybe some of us are familiar with this issue already, so I'm not going to talk much about that. Victim science, again, I will presume that we're familiar with what victim science is, but I'll be focusing more on the generalizing from Africa, why and challenges. The challenges too, I'm not going to focus more on because I think we both stated these there are challenges in Africa. Then we point to a study that I'm leading, a huge collaborators across different regions. So for benefits of that, generalizability problem is basically inability to replicate, inability for theories and findings to apply in different contexts. There are studies that have shown that 8 out of 10 samples used are from Europe, North America, and Australia. So that's a problem. And part of solving this problem is the victim science idea to pull resources together, including having large sample to test effect, kind of replicating. Part of the ideas we have is the collaborative replication project driven by open science. We have the PSA. We have a lot of PSA people here that we do this, and the many labs, the many babies issue. So, but there's a problem with these initiatives. One, these studies often focus on North American and European claims still. That
that was the aim to change this, but we still have claims from America and Europe. Secondly, most of this initiative, African population are underrepresented. So our idea, we try to project this in a study. Okay, now before then, let's just put into illustration. The CREP projects one, the many babies, we have like over 100 effects replicated and like 0 from Africa. So this is a problem. I highlighted this problem in a paper where we talk about why we should generalize from Africa when like those have like a cross-testing situation and how this can benefit psychological science. So why do we want to generalize from Africa? Right now, Africa is 70% population of the world. You can see the estimates. By the end of the century, Africa will be like 40% of the world population. We cannot ignore Africa again. So, because why? Because we for psychology to sustain its relevance, we need to get good scientists from Africa. Very important. Also, sample diversity. We've mentioned this. We need to sample Africans to test our effect. And this is very important because we're able to apply theories across world regions. And also, we can diversify our theories and have more robust theories that can apply at least to more regions. Also, rigor. So this is very important because we can exchange knowledge. So I feel a lot of people, when they talk about Africa, they're like, maybe they are not developed in terms of research. But trust me, I've worked with Africa and I've tried to fair, and I see that they have some methods and practices that I can't find in the US. I'll give an example. They specify, in Nigeria, we specify the sample, like to the class, we can say we study self-esteem among 100 level students of psychology in Adekunle Ajasin University. Like we are that specific in the kind of sample that we. So we know beyond that sample, it's difficult to apply to outside this 100 level student like that. So we can actually benefit from each other workflows. Of course, there are workflows in Africa too that we can benefit from. The challenges, are pretty much known. Low research outputs, so there are challenges why you can see what African researchers are doing, particularly because of the poor visibility. We do research, then we ask for the globally acclaimed top ranked journals, and we submit this and they publish this, and it's paywall. We don't have funds. We aren't able to subscribe to this, and so most of the times, even our research, we don't get to see them and use them because they are paywall, even locally. So how do we intend to solve it? How are we going to address this? And these are the problems, but from our own angle, we feel we need to start cross-testing. We initiated a study, transnational multi-site replication study of 3 effects originated from Africa, and to test this across Europe, North America, also Africa. Sorry if you don't have the Asia continent here because of feasibility, but it's difficult to go around these regions. So what will be the advantage of this? One, it allows us to improve African researchers' global participation. So the more they get involved in this, the more they are visible and they have the capacity to work on some of these tasks like replication, victim science tasks. Also, we were able to examine the extent to which African claims are replicable. At least we want to know maybe not just only the US claims it's difficult for us to say, but let's see maybe African claims can replicate that, and are they generalizable to other populations? So 2 major points for us doing this project. You can search for the project. We have this on OSF, so feel free to go to the OSF and use some of our materials. We have workflow on how we are conducting this study. So the first thing we did was to consult with a researcher from the Global South. So to determine, one, the type of study to replicate. Most victim science, they kind of skip some of these stages, but we want to know what Global South researchers or Africa researchers are interested in. So the type of study, very important. Then approach to study selection. In a way, we can create a workflow anyone that's interested in studying effects from Africa can use. What we found out is that Africans are kind of interested in applied social issues that have practical applications. They are not interested in major, they are interested, of course, but in theories, but they want to solve issues. They have issues to solve, so they can't afford to, and there's little funds, they can't afford to just put funds somewhere that to build theories, but to have research that's have a practical implication. Also, for the approach, what we found out that there's a need for us to involve researcher from the conceptualization stage. So what we did is to go with a bottom-up approach where the study selection is heavily, we relied heavily on the local researchers, even researchers from the US and Europe. At a point in time, they have to access the final 5 shortlisted studies. So this helps us to do it for them to nominate research areas of interest and study from the African angle, and later we can evaluate the studies with all the study populations. Okay, so again, we have this documented on OSF. You can check it out because it's a long process. We have like a longer report about it. So I will encourage you guys to check it out. I think it's nice. I'm proud of what we're doing there. So just to share results of what we found out in terms of the claims and how the preferences for the US and for Africa. What we found out, like Africans' study preference differ from Europeans and North America. Remember, we have the last 5 shortlisted studies. These studies are extramarital affair, teenage pregnancy, civic engagement, self-disclosure, condom use. These are very important claims for Africans, but are these important for the North Americans and Europeans? If you look at the pie chart here, for Africa, the orange bar, the most kind of top rank that study for them is the teenage pregnancy, followed by the extramarital affair. But this kind of is different when it comes to the Europe and North America. For Europe, yeah. Sorry, I usually go overboard. I'm sorry. I kind of talk too much. Sorry, Africans, we talk too much. I'm still talking. All right. So the bar for the charts for the Europe, like that's the top issue for them will be self-disclosure. Then the next one will be condom use negotiation. So this is very different. You can see the dichotomy between the Europeans. So also the North America is very different from the African. So for our study, we are going to go with Africa because this is what we want to do. We want to know what Africa is interested in, and let's see, maybe Europeans and will be interested in that. So again, documented on OSF, you can check it out. Open science practices. Right now we have our 246 collaborators. We're happy to have collaborators like this, and it's huge. I think we'll be able to get enough sample to test the effects. Also, we are preparing the materials right now. The reports, the registration reports, and we are translating the instruments into a number of languages already, almost 11 right now, including some African languages. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. We still have time for questions.
Yes, let's have one quick question. Let me see if there are any. Let me stop sharing. Are there any hands in the audience here? We have one, so let me just stop sharing and then, yeah. So if you can either come up, if you can find a way, or I can repeat the question if it's easy. Okay.
Yeah, okay, so yes, there is over like 1,000 languages in Africa. Our criteria is that it depends on the sites. We had sites to identify the lingua franca, that is non-speaking English population, the lingua franca, for example, a site in Burkina Faso, the lingua franca is French. And again, if they have any other widely spoken language, local language, we are happy to translate how the measure it. So every site have like two options, the lingua franca and one widely spoken language.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. Thank you so much again. And now I think it's Angeline. So can you please share your slide?
1 second. Can you see my slide? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I need to make sure that I can control it. All right. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. Hello, everyone. My name is Angeline Choi. I will be presenting this talk on behalf of the Many Babies Africa team. So before I start, I want to thank you for the organizer, Lapaya, Catherine and Chris, who invited me to these conference sections. I'm really excited to share with you about the Many Babies Consortium and why we have extended this work to Africa. So Many Baby is a big team science network of researchers from around the world working together to build a collective knowledge of early childhood development. So this one is our logo, and right now we have quite a number of extensions, and then as you can see here, we are not just like work from North America, but also extended to European, Asia, as well as Africa. So in the following sections, I want to start to talk about the motivations of Many Babies Consortium. So recently, there has been a lot of attentions about the flaws in psychological research, especially with regards to how replicable and generalizable most findings are. So in other words, there is uncertainty about if many publications can be reproduced by others, and whether or not certain findings can be generalized to most people or are specific to people who participated in the original study. So traditionally in developmental work, especially for infant work, most of the labs work alone. We design procedure and testing them on small samples of infants. And because infants or maybe young children are pretty difficult to recruit, and also like as you can imagine that the young children, they often could be emotional, and sometimes they don't always behave as we want them to in the lab. So it also means that there is difficulties to recruit and test infants, and it often takes a lot of time, months, sometimes years, especially in my thesis. It took me almost 3 years to collect a certain amount of infant that I can show to the public and publish the paper. So this leads to the pressure of published findings with small sample size that could be reliable. Because if we don't have the big sample size, actually it means that the findings that we find could be unreliable and cannot be extended. So, excuse me. In addition, findings that from a single lab, no matter how robust and replicable it is, sometimes may not be generalized to other populations around the world. Furthermore, developmental psychology labs often do things in their own particular way. For example, some labs may have infants sitting on the parents' lap during the experiment, while the other ones actually put the infants in high chair. So that may actually explain some of the variability of results that we find across different studies. And this is also something that we want to try to examine through the collaborative work in Many Babies Consortium, and see how by working together, we might be able to identify sources of variability across different studies and see how that may explain why this is so hard to replicate some findings. And based on the previous research motivations that I have explained, we realized that combining resources across lab could help us to get more precise, robust, and replicable answers on important questions in developmental psychology, and this is where many babies come in. For many babies, our consortium right now, we have been running this consortium for like several years now, and currently we have at least 6 different empirical study that include like language studies such as examined the replicability as well as generalizability in infant-directed speech. This is also one of the projects that one of the study that I put more efforts on because I was from the language part. And the Many Babies Africa study is also trying to replicate infant-directed speech in Africa. But I want to also put draw your attentions to other study because there are other aspects that other developmental psychologists are examining, including theory of mind, rule learning, social evaluations, even attentions, and using neural native immutations. And of course, we will be very happy to extend to other empirical studies. And right now, I think the team is very open to other interest in study. So I just want to emphasize that I'm going to explain a little bit more about infant-directed speech. So infant-directed speech is a way that adults often talk to infants in a very high-pitched tone that normally you will see that in reality. We call it baby talk sometimes. So it is very weird that you find adults talk to baby like how I talk to you now. Normally we would say, hey baby, something like that, right? So a lot of research has found that this kind of infant-directed speech could be related to infants' attentions, and that can be pretty widely observed in different culture. But again, previous study has been focusing on only different culture, different country, as well as based on small sample size. And this is why the Many Babies One and also its a spin-off projects have been focusing on how infant-directed speech finding can be found or replicated in different country and place. For the Many Babies Africa project that I was one of the lead in this project, right now we are at the stage where we try to collect, we're still collecting data from different places. The idea and the motivation is to increase the sample diversity and improve generalizability of the result. And the other very important motivations, not less, okay, is that we really try to build ties with the African collaborators and also build a scientific community over there. So that's why we try to extend Many Babies to Africa. And this is the first study that we try to extend that to Africa. But of course, this is not the first and also the last. We would definitely do that in other empirical study as well. So in general, right now we have 11 labs in Africa that's committed. As you can see here, there are quite a number of labs have been participated. Some of them are in the east part, some of them are in the west part, and the other one will be in the south part. So there are some challenges, of course, when we extend this kind of study to Africa. So first of all is equipment, right? Because as you may know that we are extending a study to Africa. So we need to of course, provide some kind of equipment and also training of running this kind of well-established North American studies to Africa, right? So that's why we have we did that. We applied for fund, and then we also sent equipment, and also some of my collaborators went to Africa to train, to also provide training to our collaborators. On the other hand, once we have collected once we have done that, the other challenge will be more related to ethics and data collections, and it is particularly challenging during the COVID time. Now it's better, but still a little challenging because we need to first make sure that we can get the ethics approval from the university, from our African collaborators, as well as the data collections part. How do we make sure that we would be able to collect data from a fairly a standard way that we provide procedures with, right? And like the last part that I found is very challenging, and but I still think that it is good that we have tried to control that, is time zone differences and communications. So like to end this presentations, I want to like raise the point that we are, with the many babies, are trying to build a global network, both within and across specific regions. And we want to make sure that we collaborate. But on the other hand, I also feel the need that we should also better understand African collaborators, what kind of theories and research in Africa, and try to extend that to North America. That would also help us to generalize findings. It's not just we try to generalize what we have established in North America and Europeans to Africa. So with this, I want to thank you again, and thank you for your attentions. And of course, we welcome you to join Many Babies.
Thank you so much, Angeline. That was great. Okay, do we have, let me just check. I don't think we have any hands up yet for the virtual. Do we have any hands up in the in-person for questions or comments? Anyone from the virtual? Okay. Well, maybe we might just wait for the general discussion afterwards, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Angeline. So we've got our last talk now from Kathleen. So Kathleen, if you go ahead and share your slides. Yeah, we can see them. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. So thank you so much. Today I'm going to describe a research project that I'm preparing in collaboration with Priya and Chris Chartier as an illustration of a prediction or forecasting approach to investigating generalizability in psychology. First, I'll talk about the background and goals of the investigation and provide you with an overview of the research. Then I'll describe some details of the methods and analysis plan. And finally, I'll address some challenges and limitations of this research and discuss some advantages and disadvantages of this specific approach to studying generalizability. As other people have already talked about, research in psychology tends to rely on convenient samples, typically undergraduate students from universities in Europe and North America. This practice, as you know, has been described as the weird problem, where samples from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations are used to make general claims about human psychology. And research relying on these samples may have low generalizability across cultures and contexts. Despite growing recognition of this problem, little progress has been made in expanding sampling or narrowing claims, and researchers' understanding of generalizability in psychology has not been examined empirically. Prior research has shown that researchers can predict replication and other empirical outcomes with some accuracy. Our research will investigate whether researchers can accurately predict when psychological effects will generalize across countries and sample sources, and examine what researcher characteristics relate to their prediction accuracy. So our investigation will include 4 studies linked to projects selected by the Psychological Science Accelerator. Prior to data collection for each project, we will survey researchers in the PSA who are project contributors and those who are not. These participants will read a project description and complete a series of predictions about a single focal effect. We will examine these predictions relative to the actual results of the study. Our findings will find insight into how researchers understand the generalizability of psychological effects across cultural contexts. So 4 projects are being selected by the PSA in response to 2 special calls for studies that will be carried out by our global network of researchers. Selected projects will be funded in part by the John Templeton Foundations, and so they must investigate research questions related to one or more of their strategic priorities, such as intellectual humility, religious cognition, and the science of character virtue. Each project will collect participants from university student samples and from more representative community samples. A single focal effect will be chosen from each project based on input from the proposing authors. This effect will be the result of a single inferential statistical test that answers a central research question from the project. Priority will be given to effects that are grounded in theory and supported by previous research. After reading the project and focal effect description, participants will first complete outcome and effect size predictions for the focal effect overall. Then participants will complete subsample predictions. So they will be randomly assigned to respond to these items for 10 countries in which we anticipate university and community samples to be larger than 100 participants. For our binary outcome measure, they will be asked the probability of observing a statistically significant focal effect in the hypothesized direction. And for our effect size measure, they will be asked to estimate the focal effect size using the appropriate metric. We will also measure researcher characteristics that may relate to prediction accuracy according to previous researcher theory. These will include individual difference scales and measures of researcher involvement, experience, and expertise. Other secondary tasks and measures will be included in the studies, but I'll skip over them today in the interest of time. So we're going to combine data across the 4 studies for the purposes of our analyses. And to test if researchers can accurately predict when psychological effects will generalize across regions and sample sources, first we will examine correlations between aggregate predictions of researchers at the level of subsamples. Then we will fit multi-level models predicting outcomes and effect sizes from the predictions with random effects of study, participant, and sample and country to test what researcher characteristics are associated with prediction accuracy. First, we'll compute error scores for the predictions and then use those in outcome measures in multi-level models with the researcher characteristics as predictors and nested random effects. We will examine prediction confidence, involvement in the project, highest degree, self-rated expertise in the project subfield, intellectual humility, and actively open-minded thinking as predictors of accuracy. So examining research predictions of generalizability has some substantive challenges and limitations. As planned, our research poses several logistical challenges. We need to set up each of our studies as the PSA project protocols are in development and collect data after the protocols are finalized, but before the projects begin their data collection efforts. Further, we have to choose which countries to include in our predictions before actually knowing their community and university subsample sizes. Most importantly, given the focus of the proposed research on generalizability prediction, limitations on the generalizability of our results should be acknowledged. For instance, methodological features of the research present constraints on generality. Both our chosen sample of PSA member researchers and how we will select studies and their focal effects will likely produce results that do not generalize to all researchers or all research findings. Finally, I'd like to discuss some advantages and disadvantages of a prediction-focused approach to research on generalizability. For advantages, first, international multi-site collaborations are becoming increasingly common. Some other people have talked about them today, which means that researchers have the opportunity to investigate generalizability predictions, either using existing data or in tandem with ongoing research. Second, though the focus of this approach is not the actual generalizability findings themselves, these investigations do allow for the examination of generalizability results that may not be otherwise reported with the original research. Third, the results of generalizability prediction studies may have meaningful implications for research practices. Results may inform recommendations for researchers discussing constraints on generality of their own research, or help in prioritizing what effects should be selected for future research on generalizability. As for disadvantages, a major drawback of this approach is that the design and sampling plan of the original or linked projects largely determines the scope of the research. Further, many international multi-site collaborations are often predominated by relatively weird samples and may not be well positioned to identify effect heterogeneity. Second, the primary research questions are not about the heterogeneity of the effects themselves. Therefore, the approach is an indirect means of advancing knowledge about generalizability across cultural contexts. And finally, as I mentioned in regard to our research, contending with the potential limitations on generalizability may be difficult. Sorry, I was rushing a little bit, but I'd like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for funding this research. Thank you for CIPS, or two CIPS, for allowing us to lead this conference. And thanks to all of you for being here, listening and contributing. I'm happy to answer any questions, but we might also just want to start the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I'm just going to open up for questions from both in-person or virtual. We've got one in-person hand up. I'm also, okay, so what I'm going to do is, because I don't think the sound will stretch, would you like to come up or should I repeat your question? Okay, so someone's going to come up. I also just wanted, I'm not sure if this is going to work or ruin everything, but I just wanted to, no, I don't think I can show, I don't think the cords are long enough to show that we've got a full room here, but I just wanted to let you know so that we have everyone knows that there's more people in the room. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Raj. So this is a probably an annoying question, but how are you going to have people or elicit beliefs about p-values if you don't know the sample size, given that p-values don't depend on them? I mean, I might just say, well, that's not going to be significant because I don't think that lab can recruit enough participants.
Yeah, so we'll tell the people who are doing the predictions that we'll try to get a minimum sample size of 100 in each of our subsamples. So they will be informed at least that we can identify, let's say, medium effects depending on what the actual analysis is. But you're right, one of the kind of more methodological limitations of the prediction process is the fact that we have to have we'd like to have this binary effect or no effect outcome, and that will be dependent on and variable based upon the actual subsample sizes. That's one of the reasons we chose to also include effect size predictions as part of the investigation, so that we can examine kind of both aspects of generalizability, both whether we're identifying the effect at all and also the size of the effect within that subsample.
And if I may ask a very quick second one, do you intend to include any measure of international research experience, since that might help people have a sense for how things vary?
Yeah, so we're measuring a ton of researcher characteristics. I mentioned a couple of them. We'll focus on like expertise and experience measures in a lot of exploratory analysis to try to figure out some of those types of features of researchers that might impact their accuracy. And I think you're right that being involved in a lot of these international collaborations might give you a better sense, and of course experience or expertise with cross-cultural research likely is going to increase accuracy.
Thanks, and I'm looking forward to predicting.
All right, great, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Okay, let me see if we have any hands up in the virtual sphere. I don't think we do. Okay. Are there any more questions in person? Yeah. Oh, can you come up or make it really easy for me to repeat? Those are your options. Okay, thank you so much. Oh no.
Thanks. That study design sounds really interesting. I was wondering if you have any a priori predictions about what researcher characteristics will be relevant, or is it just exploratory?
So We've chosen a set, I believe, of 6 characteristics to pre-register hypotheses regarding. They're not, basically, we're prioritizing these as our primary, although they may not necessarily yield results. And these are things that have been shown in either research or other prediction and forecasting studies in the past to affect accuracy. So we're looking at 2 individual differences: intellectual humility and actively open-minded thinking. And then another interesting one is we're looking at involvement in the project. So we'll actually be recruiting both collaborators and people who aren't in the project to see if collaborators potentially know more because of their familiarity, or maybe they have certain like biases and generality that will actually make them worse at doing the predictions.
Thanks. I'm afraid I don't think we have any time left for questions on this specific presentation. So I just wanted to first say thank you so much to all of our speakers. You were all great. And yeah, I really enjoyed the talks. And now we're a little bit over time, but I think we have like about 25 minutes left for a more general discussion, which I'm really excited about. So the first kind of question that I wanted to like prioritize people who aren't the speakers basically at first. So just a kind of big general question. What is your approach that you take to studying generalizability in your own research, both to the virtual participants, but also other people who are here? Does anyone want to talk a little bit about their own approach to studying generalizability? Yes, someone on the virtual. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that must be me. Hi, I'm Yuichi, and so to answer your question first, I was going to respond to Daniel's question, but to answer your question, I advocate for including constraints on generality in every paper. I was one of the authors of that paper that proposed it, so that would be my response to that. But I'd like to also, can I answer Daniel's question? So his question, he posed 2 questions at the end of his talk. First was, what would psychologists do? Yeah, he presented evidence that findings are very different in Bangladesh and Indonesia compared to the US or North America or Europe. And I think psychologists, I mean, I guess I'm being a little bit dramatic or maybe somewhat cynical, is psychologists would say, one of them must be wrong. And if that's an American psychologist, they would say, they must be wrong, we are right. I think that if that, to the extent that that's true, I think that illustrates a fundamental problem in how we think about our science, which is that there must be one truth, and that the important findings must be the same across cultures. And so I think, so then his second question is, what should we do? I try to make it quick. I have one philosophical answer and then sort of a practical practice answers about how we do our science. The philosophical answer is that I think we need to swap our assumption that usually goes like, unless otherwise shown, findings are considered general, or that valuable findings are the ones that are general. We need to swap that with, unless otherwise shown, findings are local, and that local findings are important. Another way to say it is that we should follow what anthropologists have been doing. And psychology can be thought of as essentially quantitative anthropology done in different places. So that's sort of my philosophical answer. And the practical answer is that, obviously big science approaches that we saw today are great answers. However, they are costly, both in terms of human resources and financial resources needed. And so in order to get there, or to have more such big science approaches, I think we need to change the way we publish our findings. In other words, if somebody does a study in Bangladesh, without having to compare that against the US. Or in Daniel's research, I mean, there's already a well-established findings done in North America. But let's say it was a new phenomenon, and then that also said something to the effect that we suspect that there may be cultural differences. Papers of that nature should be published, should be in the body of knowledge, so that in time, in 10 years, 20 years, there will be lots of research findings reported from many different cultural contexts. And then at that time, we are in a position to ask the question, do similar things happen across cultures, or do we see significant evidence of heterogeneity? I have this phrase that's said something to the effect that we should trade desire for instant generalizability to ultimate knowledge about the generality of the findings. So anyway, this is very long, but this prompted lots of thoughts in me. So thank you so much for all of your presentations and for the organizers of this conference.
Thank you so much. Do we have any either responses to that or any, you have a response? Would you like?
If I may, I mean, I feel it's wrong to try to respond, but especially because I think that in the second part, you sort of weakened your initial claim a bit that we should become like anthropologists, radical particularists who study one thing in one context and do not try to generalize, which I think would be a loss, right? I think we should be trying to understand why things differ instead of saying, well, we don't even attempt to. And at least I know some anthropologists who are quite dissatisfied with that situation on their field. One thing, and I think that theory can guide our exploration for how things might differ. One thing my group did is we built a large database of studies on human cooperation. We have 2,000 studies included. We have, I think it's 13,000 effects or something like this. My dear friend John Spadaro ran a massive meta-regression trying to predict why the rate of cooperation in simple games, business dilemma games, varies across countries with dozens of predictors. There's lots of variation and nothing explains it. But should we now give up? So I think this, to me, the answer cannot be, well, somehow it differs and we don't know why. I think we should build better explanations for this. And part of the solution might be to do what Dan did and try to develop methods that work locally to try it, to understand maybe that methods differ, right? So better, I would like to point towards actually trying to build local methods for global phenomena, right? That would be my approach.
That are broadly comparable.
Broadly comparable.
So
but especially
I just want to say I couldn't agree more. But I think before people would want to ask why, they need to be challenged by the what. And so, but yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's where we want to go.
Thank you so much. We've got a raised hand, Natalia. Go for it.
I'd just like to point out, I mean, for the few that already know me, knows that I'm a bit like passionate about this topic, but I think what UC wanted to say is that I'm trying to convey that. I mean, what I got from what he said was when it would be great to get an universal knowledge on psychology, and we should also strive for that in some ways, having large international collaborations. I've been part of some of these initiatives. The thing with psychology, international psychology, is especially what we call the weird psychology, is that there are a lot of studies that they do with a small sample, very limited sample in a very limited context, and in the paper, they make generalizable assumptions to the whole humanity. So it's not that we shouldn't stop doing or should stop looking for a generalizable universal science, but we should look at when we are not doing that. We should be more humble and make assertions based on the sample that we have at the time. There is something that I wanted to say, because many babies, there are many babies people here, and it's that I just got an email from Behavior and Brain Sciences that they have a new section on books. I don't know if it's a new section, but they are asking for people to write a commentary on a new book by Elizabeth Spelk. So she, of course, is a famous research on infant research, and it's, I took a look at the presses. I think is the paper explaining what her book is about. And that the first thing I wondered is why she won't say, I love her work. I deeply respect her work, but she won't say nothing. She won't say anything about, she'll say anything about culture or variations in their samples. And it's there, like her paper doesn't say that, she doesn't say a thing about where these infants come from, why we should wonder if culture would affect them or not. She mentions like cultural differences like about a couple of times, and it's very on passing. I'm not sure if her book does that, but I wanted to illustrate that not as a criticism towards Spelk's work, but it's like every time is an uphill battle, because we keep talking about the need to consider variations across samples, and as an assumption, an initial assumption. And every time someone who comes from a prestigious university writes a book or writes a paper where they come and say things like infants do that, children do that. And when we look at that, they always come from this assumption that they are looking at middle class white people. And sometimes that thing generalizes to other children, sometimes they don't, but they don't think that when they look at those children, they never wander from, they never start from the point of maybe we're just talking about a specific kind of children or a specific kind of infant. So I just wanted to point that out, because I think here's the right place to say that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to see if there's any hands in the in-person audience. Yeah, we have one. Would you like to come up? Yeah. So, Angeline, we will get to you. I just want to try and alternate. Yeah.
It was actually just a question to everybody, but inspired by Daniel and Adi both, really, which is, you know, when things don't generalize, or when you don't find the same findings in different settings or in different places, has anyone actually gone to ask the people there why they think that might be? You know, it's kind of like your social distancing thing didn't work there. Is that maybe just not a and you had to work hard to find out what the concept was? Is that maybe just not a concept that makes sense?
We did ask them, and I showed the graph.
Yeah.
So, and absolutely, mainly it just wasn't a concept that mattered to them in the context of that specific kind of task. Now, we do show that people who feel close to each other do help each other in day-to-day tasks. And there affects behavior in other ways. But the Rackham and Jones task, which is the original one, that's what you just covered. They're just like needed. And if you look at that graph I showed, it turns out need is important for everyone. So I hesitate to say this, but maybe need is universal factor, right? And social discounting seems very specific. And so I agree completely. We need to talk.
Yeah, so it's kind of, it's fine to take the research into other places, but I think we need to be a lot more transparent about the fact that I'm a white person who came up with this idea. I live in Scotland. And, you know, Scottish people are special, but I also was born in South Africa, and there's those two contexts that I might have. But how is this going to translate to somebody in Brazil? And I don't know very many Brazilian people. So how do I do that? And I think that's maybe sometimes some of the things that really concern me is about the generalizability and about the idea that we just literally say to people, this is going to go from this sample to everybody else. That is the thing that deeply concerns me. So I think it's not really a new thing. I think it's just agreeing with everybody. So
if you come up, but can you come up so that they can hear you? Yeah.
So you make such an important point, and I think that also points to something that came out in discussions in earlier conferences was this real focus on post-positivism and hypothesis testing. And I think that good science involves a whole process that includes hypothesis testing and trying to figure out the reasons for things, but also does really good formative and exploratory work. For example, in the field, asking people what they think about a concept, right? And so I think that's a real value of anthropology, although as someone pointed out, one of the weaknesses is we stop there in anthropology and then we don't test the hypotheses. Bringing those two together, I think, makes for the best scientific method. And that's related to, you got to ask people, right? And you got to talk to them and observe in a second. Thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Angeline.
Okay, thank you. I think I have two answers, maybe not answer, but two comments to different questions. So the first question is more related to like the developmental work. And I truly, to be honest, like me, even though I'm no longer working in the academia, to be honest, but I still voluntarily work on publications. And I have to emphasize that it's very hard for us to publish paper, like because of the difficulties in recruiting and testing young children. So one of the things that I want to point out is the strong pressure of publications and how the number of like quantity as well as quality of publications like push some of the results. Maybe what we have observed right now is that we might be pushed or maybe stressed because we need to publish in order to get the grant, right? We need to get the funding. We need to make sure that we can secure the positions, right? So that's one of the things. That's why sometimes we see small sample size, but publications, at least in the past, may have tried to draw stronger conclusions based on small sample size, right? Because otherwise, how are you going to publish that paper? It's also related to the culture of publishing, right? Because the reviewers want us to do that. I still remember, like, I published this paper already. But this paper, I underwent 4 different trials of different journals, and I rewrote it 3 times in order to publish that paper. Now, I want to emphasize one thing is that for the first at least 1 to 2 round to a more prestigious journal in these review sections, I want to say that I was asked why I cannot find a significant finding based on my sample, because the reviewer think that there is a relationship over there. I need to justify that, but sometimes we just cannot justify that. We just can't find that relationship. So that actually leads to difficulties in publications as well. So that may be one of the reasons why that drives some of the non-replicable findings, or maybe like a drive why we might need to maybe overstate what we have found in the publications in order to get rid of this. So I really hope that not just we try to collaborate in a bigger team in the future, but how can we actually improve the culture of understanding how we publish paper without significance and just reflecting the status of our findings in publications procedures as well as grant applications. So that's things that I think we're moving towards to that part. And I think a lot of people have increased their awareness of this part.
Thanks so much. Maybe I'll just see if anyone else has a point and then we can come back to the second question. Is there anyone in the in-person audience who has anything to say either on this point or just generally like additional approaches to generalizability that we might not have got to cover already? Yeah, can you come up? Sorry, or just tell me, yeah.
And so, yeah, then a new format of publication.
Yeah, I'm just trying to type it because I thought that was easier than rephrasing it. But yeah, basically, maybe useful to develop a new format that kind of encourages authors to take be more open about these constraints on generalities. Yeah, and being open to papers without conclusions if nothing can be concluded from a single study, for example. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, do we have anyone else virtual who has something to say right now? Otherwise, if we don't have anyone new, then Angeline can go for your second point, but Kathleen maybe first. Oh, sorry, Kathleen North, actually. I'm not sure who put their hand up first.
Oh yeah, well, I was just curious if anybody in person or online might have some ideas about new or unique ways of researching generalizability that might not have been covered today, or that might not be possible yet, but could be, just because it's great to, of course, acknowledge constraints, but it also would be great to figure out new and better ways to examine the problem itself.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'm going to let people ponder that one while Sakshi speaks, but maybe Sakshi can speak to that anyway as well, or in addition.
Yeah, I don't know if this builds on your point, Kathleen, but I think one of the things that I've been thinking about is who is that one subset of the population that gets completely excluded in all our conversations in generalizability. And of course, Dan presented his work from rural Bangladesh. But let's think about big team science studies, and how many of those big team science studies actually pick up on rural and peri-urban populations, right? Now that in these countries, in some of these regions, whether it's parts of Africa or parts of South Asia, where I come from, rural populations make up most of the country's population. So if we are taking 100, 200 samples in big team science studies, despite it being an absolutely step forward, it's still restricting or skewing. If you go back to sort of the visual I was trying to illustrate in our understanding of how psychological phenomena is generalized. So I think it's also starting with identifying the group that gets missed out completely out of the conversation on generalizability, and then thinking a lot more deeply about sort of how establishing generalizability in those populations requires a complete rehaul. So like Adi's doing with his work, starting with diverse research questions, mechanisms, theories. I think someone in the audience had a comment on turning upside the method. So there's a lot of rehaul and a lot of rethinking to truly establish generalizability, and it's a really high bar. So I don't know if generalizability is the same as is setting a very high bar, and whether we should all sort of prescribe to it, or like Yuji said, focus a lot more on localizing, because it takes away the sort of focus on generalizability. So that was just a very quick.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone in the in-person audience who has a response to that? Can you, is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet, just to make sure first? If not, then you can come up, yeah.
So I had a very quick thought on this, which is there's two ways of doing cross-cultural studies. One is with collaborations, right? I mean, before big team science, this was long been a thing that cross-cultural psychologists recruit collaborators all over the world, and they run their studies on the local student population. And then you sometimes get really strange results. Like I've seen a study where the sample from Pakistan and from Germany was similar on social liberalism, but it was the most elite private university in Pakistan that was recruited into the sample. And the other solution is let's work with a polling company that recruits representative samples. And my lab has done this with large samples across the world, 40, 50, there's studies with 80 countries. You have, of course, things like the World Earth Survey. It's really expensive, right? So I don't think so maybe it's good to think to rethink this big team science that's one approach, but it has this limitation. Yes, it's perhaps more equitable in terms of who can get involved. It doesn't require $500,000 or euros to run the study, but it does have the drawback. On the other hand, we have this other approach. It's not like it's not happening, right? And these studies they do recruit the rural population as well. So it is possible. It just costs a lot of money.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who listened, who had questions, all our speakers. We're going to have to head to the plenary session now. But yeah, just a big applause for everyone. Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully if you want to continue this conversation on the Slack channel, I would love that. So yeah, feel free to add additional stuff there. Thank you.
The last one.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priya, for organizing.
Thank you for organizing. Bye-bye.
Thank you.